ever feel like your identity kind of shifts depending on who you're with? Like, are you more of a, I don't know, a musician or say someone from a long line of fishers?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a question that gets right at the heart of ethnicity, right?
Yeah.
This fascinating mix of belonging, how we're perceived, and how we navigate the world.
And you've hit on something really key there, that it's not about some like fixed thing inside us.
Hmm.
This deep dive is all about unpacking that, using your sources to understand how ethnicity really works, not just in theory, but, in our everyday lives.
Right, because I think we often assume it's about groups forming because they're, well, inherently different. Like differences are what kind of draw the lines.
It's a common misconception. One of your sources actually flips that on its head. It talks about how strong ethnic identities often emerge where groups are surprisingly similar, but in constant contact.
Okay, now that's counterintuitive. Do you have an example?
Absolutely. Think of the Fur and Bagra people in Sudan. The Fur are farmers, rooted in their land. The Bagar are nomadic herders, always on the move. Totally different lifestyles, right?
Yeah, wouldn't think they'd have much in common.
And yet, they're economically intertwined,
Yeah.
trading,
Hmm.
relying on each other for different resources. That constant interaction, that bumping up against each other's differences, actually reinforces their distinct identity.
So it's like they need that contrast to define who they are.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You probably don't walk around with a strong sense of your own, like, breakfast food identity, right?
Mhm.
But if you move somewhere with totally different breakfast options, you'd quickly realize, oh, I do have preferences. I have a breakfast culture. It's that exposure to something different that clarifies your own.
Wow, that is such a good analogy. Okay, so if it's not just about inherent differences, does that mean ethnicity is more about how groups perceive each other, even if those perceptions aren't always accurate?
You're spot on. One of your sources uses the example of Thailand, where people often emphasize cultural traits they believe are totally unique to them. But in reality, their neighboring groups share many of those same traits.
It's like that saying, the grass is always greener. Sure. We tend to fixate on what we think sets us apart, which might not be the full picture.
Exactly. And this ties into the whole idea of stereotypes, which, while often inaccurate and based on bias, still reveal a lot about how we categorize each other, how we make sense of a complex social world.
It's almost like we need those categories, even if they're flawed, to navigate the world around us.
And those categories can shift depending on the situation, which is where we get into this fascinating idea of situational ethnicity.
Okay, now that sounds intriguing. What exactly does that mean?
Well, one of your sources dives into this fascinating case study of the Sami people in Norway. They navigate their identity in really strategic ways, depending on who they're interacting with. Sometimes they emphasize their distinct Sami heritage, their unique language and traditions.
So they're really highlighting what makes them different.
Exactly. That's called contrasting. But then in other situations, maybe in more formal settings, or when interacting with the majority Norwegian population, they might downplay those differences, focusing on shared values or experiences.
So it's like code switching, but with your whole cultural identity. You're choosing which aspects to emphasize or downplay, depending on the context.
Precisely. And this matching strategy, as it's called, isn't about denying their Sami identity. It's about agency. It's about recognizing that ethnicity isn't a box you're trapped in, but a dynamic tool you can use to navigate different social spaces.
Which kind of makes you wonder if it can be so fluid, what even binds a group together in the first place? Is it purely a shared identity, a sense of belonging? Or are there more practical aspects at play?
That's a question that has, puzzled scholars for ages. Some argue it's all about that we feeling, that powerful sense of shared history, traditions, maybe even a common language, like we're the group name and this is what unites us.
Right, like a shared story that everyone identifies with.
Exactly. But then others argue it's more about, well, practical benefits. Like belonging to a certain ethnic group might give you access to resources, political power, better economic opportunities. It's less about feeling connected and more about what that connection, gets you in a practical sense.
So solidarity versus strategy, almost like we're stronger together versus what's in it for me.
In a way, yeah. And the truth is, it's often a blend of both. Your sources mentioned this really interesting example from Mauritius. The Hindu population there shares a broad ethnic identity, but their social standing varies drastically depending on their caste.
So even within a single ethnic group, you have these layers of like hierarchy and inequality.
Exactly. Which goes to show that ethnicity is never simple. It intersects with class, religion, all those other parts of our identity, creating this very intricate picture.
It's like we each have this whole deck of cards, and the hand we play depends on, like, who we're with and what game we're playing.
That's a fantastic analogy. And speaking of different hands, think about how states have historically dealt with diversity within their borders. It's another layer on top of all this, personal identity stuff.
Yeah. Right, because it's not just about how individuals see themselves or each other, but how those identities play out on a larger, well, political scale.
Precisely. And it's taken many forms. Sometimes it's segregation, keeping different groups separate, often with one dominant group holding more power.
Like apartheid in South Africa, a really stark example of how segregation gets built into law and enforced by the state.
Exactly. Then there's assimilation, this idea of minorities blending in with the majority culture, often at the expense of their own traditions or language. The melting pot idea, which, as your source points out, has been a big part of American history.
Right, the idea that everyone blends together to create this new unified identity. But you're saying it's not always that straightforward?
Not at all. Your sources use the example of Black Americans to illustrate this. Even when assimilation is the goal, it's not equally achievable for everyone. They argue that visible markers of difference, like skin color, are harder to erase, making it much tougher to fully assimilate compared to, say, European immigrants, who are more easily absorbed into the white majority.
Which highlights how deeply intertwined ethnicity can be with something as, well, visible as race, adding yet another layer of complexity to these dynamics.
Absolutely. And that brings us to today's world, where globalization and migration are creating even more diverse and fluid societies. One of your sources called it superdiversity. Have you heard of that term?
I've definitely come across it, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what makes it different from previous waves of migration.
It's a great question, because it's not just about numbers. Superdiversity describes a situation where you have all these different groups coming in, but also a much wider range of reasons for migrating, different legal statuses, and vastly different cultural backgrounds. It's not the melting pot of the past, but it's not a simple mosaic either. It's far more, well, intricate.
It's like trying to categorize a rainbow. All those colors blending into each other. Where do you even draw the lines?
Exactly. And in a way, that's a good thing. It challenges those old categories, forcing us to acknowledge the true complexity of identity in the 21st century.
It seems like this would make it even more challenging for groups whose identities are so closely tied to a particular place, a way of life that might be threatened in this, increasingly globalized world.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the unique case of indigenous peoples. They're often dealing with the legacy of colonization, forced assimilation, the loss of land and resources. Their very survival often depends on engaging with the same systems that have historically marginalized them.
It's like needing to learn the language of your opponent just to have a conversation, let alone fight for your rights.
Exactly. Their experience really underscores the power dynamics at play when we talk about ethnicity. It's not just about celebrating diversity. It's about acknowledging historical injustices and working towards a more equitable future for all groups, regardless of their size or influence.
It's almost like they're caught in this impossible bind, needing to engage with a system that's been, well, stacked against them just to advocate for their own ways of life.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. One of your sources talked about it as walking in two worlds, maintaining their traditions while navigating the complexities of a modern, globalized society. It's about cultural survival, not just preservation.
And that idea of navigating different worlds, of choosing how to present yourself, it really underscores the point that we're not just one thing, right? Our ethnic background is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
You said it. We contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman would say.
Oh, yeah?
Your sources really highlighted this, pointing out that beyond ethnicity, we have identities tied to our family, our profession, our beliefs, our passions. And those identities can overlap. They can clash, or they can totally take center stage depending on the situation.
It's like we each carry this whole deck of cards, and the hand we play depends on who we're with and what game we're playing.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the dynamic nature of identity. Like, think back to the musician from Sapmi. Are they more a musician or more Sami? Well, the answer is, it depends. Who are they interacting with? What feels most relevant in that moment?
Right, and we're all constantly making those kinds of calculations, even if we don't realize it. Like at a family reunion, those familial ties might feel strongest, but at a protest for social justice, maybe your political beliefs or ethnic identity come to the forefront.
Exactly. It's like choosing the right tool for the job. We're always assessing which parts of ourselves are most, useful or maybe even most vulnerable in a given situation.
Which can be a really powerful thing. Like with the Sami example, they were consciously choosing to either contrast or match their behavior depending on who they were dealing with. They were leveraging their identity to navigate a complex social landscape.
Precisely. And it highlights that this isn't just theoretical. It's not just academics debating definitions. These dynamics of ethnicity, of belonging, of how we see ourselves and others, they have real-world consequences. They shape our interactions, how resources are distributed, even how power plays out in society.
Which brings me back to that question we keep bumping up against: what does it even mean to belong? Because it's clearly more nuanced than just, ticking a box on a census form.
Right. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Belonging is fluid. It's contextual. It's something we're constantly negotiating throughout our lives. And that can be challenging, for sure. But it also means we have agency. We get to shape our own identities, figure out where we fit in, and hopefully contribute to a world where multiple belongings aren't just tolerated but celebrated.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of ethnicity, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I think the most crucial takeaway is this. Ethnicity isn't some static label. It's a dynamic force that shapes our worldviews, our relationships, our very sense of self. By grappling with its complexities, we don't just become more informed, we become more empathetic, more effective at navigating our increasingly interconnected world.
And maybe, just maybe, by understanding these dynamics, we can start to build bridges instead of walls. So as you go about your day, think about those multiple threads that make up who you are and how those threads connect you to the broader tapestry of human experience. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.